Well, there's my Rocky having a sleep. He's laying across me there, having a good sleep. Quite the cat. Anyway, this is part 2 of my story of Mrs. White, who was my teacher for the 6 weeks or so that I lived in an old decommissioned Grey Nuns convent in Eganville, Ontario. So I'll start where I left off. My first day of school, as I came up to the school there, up the street from the old stone convent, which was next door, I rounded the corner, kind of went in through a gate there, and I'm having a look at the schoolyard as I go. And I was thinking to myself, what am I dealing with here? This is a strange place. The first thing I noticed was this great big fella. It turns out he was over 6 feet tall. Now bear in mind, this school only went to grade 8. And he was massive. He was just a mountain of a kid. And he was laying on the ground in the dust on his belly. And he was drawn with a stick. He had a piece of a twig or something there, and he was drawing pictures on the ground, I thought to myself, this is what kind of a place is this, right away. I wondered. Anyway, I'll tell you something about that kid, though. Like I say, he can't have been any older than, say, in grade 8 or so, because the school only went up to grade 8. And he was huge. He was just a huge boy, And he'd lay there on the ground in the dust, and he'd draw pictures in the dirt with a stick. And never spoke a word. You'd never hear a word out of him, He never spoke. I don't even know if he could speak, really. Maybe he couldn't. He might have been mute. I don't know. But one thing I did discover after I'd been there for a while, because I did go over and look and see what he was doing, he was an artist. He really was. He was an artist. The pictures he drew, of course, were very temporary because the wind and the rain would take them away. But he drew beautiful art. Just in the dust with a stick, that boy drew beautiful art. And I don't know what his story was, and I don't know what became of him, but he was an artist. Definitely an artist. He had talent beyond there are professional artists that couldn't do what this kid was doing. Just in the dirt with a stick, just with nothing. Literally just the dirt on the ground and a stick he picked up off a tree. So, he looked odd. His appearance was odd. His demeanor was odd. Laying down there in a pair of bib overalls and a lumberjack shirt. In a pair of work boots, and over 6 feet tall, and probably weighed 300 pounds, and drawn in the dirt with a stick. But that boy was an artist, and it's amazing. It goes to show you can't judge a book by its cover. First appearances can be deceiving, and anyway. That's one of those mysteries I suppose I'll never understand. But this kid with his stick and his beautiful artwork. And like I say, it was all temporary because the wind and the rain would take it away. And maybe that made it more special. Really, when something can only be enjoyed for a very short time. I wish I had had a camera and had been able to take some pictures of the stuff that kid drew. It'd blow you away if you could see it. Anyway, then of course I had my meeting with Mrs. White, my first meeting with her, where she called me a son of a whore, and ordered me to sit behind the filthy Indian boy, which wasn't true, by the way. He wasn't filthy. He didn't stink or anything. She told me he stunk. He didn't. Anyway, that's all in the previous video. If you want to watch that and haven't yet, that's all in part 1. Now, getting on with Mrs. White. She didn't like me. She didn't like me at all, because I was the son of one of these women that had, in her mind, had caused the sisters not to have their convent anymore. She blamed the women who were staying there for that. Now, really, they had voluntarily moved because they couldn't afford to maintain the building. So they had amalgamated with the convent in Renfrew. They were a dying order, and there weren't enough of them on Ivory Building to justify the expense of upkeep and heating and all that. That's why the convent was vacated by them. Nobody pushed them out. Nobody bullied them out. It was just life and circumstances that had caused that to happen. The world was changing in some ways, and that's just how it goes. And then the building had been repurposed. But anyway, in her mind, we were at fault for that. And she did not like me. And one day, when all the other kids were leaving to go for lunch, at lunchtime I used to leave. I used to walk back over to the old convent there, and I'd just sit in the kitchen and eat a sandwich and then go back to school. But first I'd check on my little sister. I was always concerned about her. So I always wanted to go home at lunchtime to see how she was doing and make sure everything was good with her. I was very protective of her. It's funny because now, in a way, the roles have changed. I'm in my second childhood, and she's more of an adult than I am, I guess. And she's kind of protective of me now in many ways. So it's funny how the roles have changed. But in those days, I was the one anyway. It fell on me, and I took it pretty seriously. So, but this one day, Mrs. White, when the rest of them were filing out, she pointed at me and she said, You will remain here. I want to talk to you. And I thought, oh, this isn't good. And whatever I thought it wasn't good, it wouldn't be. And I was always right. That's one thing I never got wrong. If I thought, oh, this isn't good, it wouldn't be good. And it wasn't. It wasn't good. When all the rest of them had left, she motioned for me to come and stand in front of her desk. I got up out of my seat and I went over and stood there, and she says, I'm going to put some questions to you and I want some straight answers. I said, yes, ma'am. What do you want to know? And she says, what goes on over there? I says, over where? I said, over at the shelter? Yeah, and the convent. The convent that belongs to the sisters, where they should be living. But instead, women like your mother are living over there. She said, I want to know what goes on over there. And I said, well, you have to be more specific. I don't really know what you're asking, Mrs. White. She says, well, all right, I'll break it down for you. Do men ever come to visit? And I said, yes, ma'am, sometimes they do. Sometimes relations of the people staying there come to visit. Sometimes even the men that they have left. If they were in a relationship and left a man, sometimes those men come to see them for different reasons. She says, yeah, all right. Anyone else? I don't know. Friends, I guess, sometimes. I don't know. We've had men over there, for sure, visiting different ladies. And she says, do any of them stay overnight? And I said, no, that doesn't happen. I said, no men stay overnight there. And she says, well, I don't believe you. And I said, well, you asked me, and I've told you. No men stay overnight there. Well, you're lying. I said, no, ma'am, I'm not lying. Yes, you are. But never mind about that. I've got another question for you. Can you see your face in the floors? I kind of looked at her. I said, what? What do you mean, can I see my face in the floors? She says, well, it's like I said, can you see your face in the floors? Do they keep the floors clean? I said, yes, ma'am, the floors are clean. Do they polish them? No, ma'am, they don't polish them. But they scrub them. I said, the floors are scrubbed, the floors are clean. She says, but they don't polish them. I said, no, ma'am, they don't. And she says, well, when the sisters were there, they polished those floors, and they were so shiny, they were like a mirror. You could see your face in the floors. I said, well, ma'am, I've never seen my face in the floors over there, but they are clean. Well, she said, I don't believe you. You're lying to me. And I said, Mrs. White, this is the second time now that you've called me a liar. I said, are you sure you want to ask me any more questions? It seems that you think anything I tell you will be a lie. I said, is there any point to continuing to ask me questions if I'm just going to lie to you? In your estimation, if I'm just lying to you, is there any more point to this conversation? And she said, no, I guess there isn't. Go on, she said, get out of my sight, you disgust me. You're just a disgusting liar. Get out of my sight. I don't want to see you. I said, yes, ma'am. Out I went. Went to have my lunch. That was one story. Anyway, I remember that. She was kind of a cruel going person. She was I don't know why she was that way. Everybody has a story, and I did say that in the last video too, and she's not coming off very good with these stories I'm telling, and maybe I'm being unfair to her, but I can only relate my experiences with her, which weren't good. And she definitely did have a bias against me because she literally saw me as a son of a whore, you know. So, anyway, that was another story about Mrs. White. I remember she used to pick on the native Indian boy that I sat behind. She really picked on him. He just didn't speak or anything. He just seemed like he was trying to stay under the radar as much as he could, you know. There was one incident involving my little sister, and what had happened is our dad had come up to Eganville to talk to our mom. I guess he was trying to convince her to come home. Anyway, she wasn't coming home, and that's all there was to it, so he had to leave, but he was up there. He did speak to her. He was allowed in. You know, men were allowed to go in there. Mrs. White had asked me that, and I told her the truth. And he had a conversation with her. You have to pardon me, I got my nose and everything. Just, things aren't good that way. Things aren't very good right now as far as how I'm feeling, but bear with me, please. Please bear with me and be patient with me. The thing is, what happened was my dad, he had left. Now, my little sister was really close to our dad. You know, very close to him. She was really a daddy's girl. And she used to cry every night for her papa. She called him Papa. And she called our mother Mama and our father Papa. And she used to cry for her papa, you know. Every night she'd cry for her papa, and it was sad, you know, and we couldn't console her. You know, what could you say? What could you do? She was 3 years old, you know. You couldn't explain it to her. And she really missed her papa anyway. And so she had gaffled onto this big wheel tricycle. You all probably remember those things, those plastic trike type things where the kid would sit low to the ground in the thing, and with the big handlebars and stuff and the big wheel in the front of it. She gaffled onto one of those that happened to be around the convent, and she used to ride that thing all over the place. And I'm sitting in the classroom. I'm in the back corner, so I'm near to the window. And I hear her out. This was a stinking hot day in May. And you know, so the windows are open. And I hear her out there. I hear that plastic wheel on the gravel. The street outside was unpaved. It was a gravel street. Queen Street in Eganville was a gravel street at that time. And I hear on the gravel this thing going down, and I hear her yelling and crying. And she's yelling, Papa, come back. Papa, come back. And I thought, oh shit, she's out, you know, on the street. And see, it was getting close to noontime. And at noontime, the high school kids from around there used to race with their cars. And they used to come down a side street, which was straight downhill. And then they'd make a sharp left-hand turn onto the gravel street, which was Queen Street, which is the street that ran up past the old convent and the school and everything. And you'd see them. They'd come down that hill and they'd hit the gravel and the old cars would fishtail and everything. It wasn't unusual to see a 57 Ford or a 62 Chev or a 65 Buick or whatever, coming down that hill and then hit that gravel and fishtail and everything. And then they'd go speeding up Queen Street past those buildings and the gravel flying and the dust and everything. And I thought, if they come through here like that, they'll run her over before they even know she's there. So, anyway, I'd gotten up out of my seat and went to the window, and I saw her crying and going down the street on this big wheel, and I thought, I got to get out there and get her off the street. So I told Mrs. White, of course, was screaming at me, you take your seat, you sit down, you don't have leave to stand up. You sit down, And I said, Mrs. White, I have to go. I have to get my sister off the street. She said, you do no such thing. You will take your seat. You will sit down. And I said, Mrs. White, I'm sorry. I have to go. And I left. And she said, you disobey me, you'll regret it. And I said, I have to go. That's all there is to it. I have to go. And I left. I went and I got my sister off the street. Of course, the poor little thing was inconsolable. I took her back around to the old convent there, handed her over to my mother, and then I came back to the school to face Mrs. White, and I knew it was going to be bad, but it had to be done, so I go into the classroom, and she's sitting there, and at her desk, her desk was at the front of the room, so she could look at us, or whatever. When I walked in there, she stood up from her desk, and she says, you are in a lot of trouble. She said, I want you to report to the office, and I forget the principal's name, but she said, I want you to tell Mr. So-and-so that you are to be strapped for what you have done. So I go down to the office and knock on the door there, and Mr. Principal, he yells for me to come in. I open the door, I walk into his office, he's sitting behind his desk. He says, what can I do for you? And I says, well, sir, Mrs. White sent me down here to be strapped. And he says, she did. Well, before I do that, how about you sit down in that chair there in front of me and tell me what this is about? So I did. I sat down in the chair and I told him the whole story. And he says, no, he said, you're not going to be strapped. He said, you did right. And, I'm not going to strap you for doing right. You looked after your sister. That's what you should be doing. And he said, you go back up there and you tell Mrs. White that I said there'll be no strapping, and that if she has any problems with that, she can come down here and see me about it. So I thanked him, and that's what I did. I go back upstairs, and she gets back up out of her chair, and she's standing there with a big grin on her face and wringing her hands, and she says, so did you get strapped? Did you get strapped? And she's all excited. And I said, no, ma'am, I didn't. And what? What do you mean you didn't get strapped? Didn't you tell him he was to strap you? And I said, yes, ma'am, I did. But he wouldn't do it because he said that I did right, and he said, if you have any problem with that, you can go downstairs and talk to him about it. Well, she was just deflated, She was really upset about that. Anyway, she said, well, just take your seat, like that. She was mad, But that was another story, anyway, about Mrs. White. Anyway, I was really happy to leave there, I'll tell you. When we left that place, I can't even begin to tell you how happy I was about that. I hated it there. But, like I say, it was a bunch of lessons learned anyway, and the whole experience is as bad as it was, and it was bad. We were in a really precarious position. I didn't know what was going to become of us. See, my little sister, she was at a disadvantage because she had no knowledge really of anything that was going on. She knew what was happening, but she didn't know what was happening. In my case, I knew what was happening and I understood it, And I had knowledge of what the plan was as far as what the next step would be and so on, where we were going from there and all the rest of it. I knew all that, but, in my case, it was more just worry, because knowledge can bring worry too. And so I had an understanding of how dangerous and precarious our situation really was. And my sister didn't have that. But then, being in the dark about things brings its own kinds of worries. So she had her own thing going on, and we just didn't have the words. I know I didn't anyway. I didn't know how to console her. And so my thing was I became very protective. And I just really guarded her with my life. Because, I realized how bad it was. And I realized how vulnerable she was. Anyway, I'm going to break down if I keep this up, so I'm going to stop now. But that was just some of the experience that we had. We got through it. There was a lot more bad stuff happened after that, but we got through it. And, yeah, anyway, I guess that's it for now. So from myself and Rocky, I hope you all have a good day. And there's Rocky again. I don't know if you'll see him because I can't see what you're seeing. But talk later.